They said I had gone mad, and for 3 years the world believed them. But madness, I learned, is simply the name they give to women who refuse to be silent. I remember the exact moment my life became a locked room. It was the autumn of my 22nd year, and the leaves outside Holloway Manor had turned the color of dried blood. My father had been dead for only 6 weeks, and the grief still sat heavy in my chest like a stone I could not swallow. I had not yet learned that grief would become the least of my burdens. My stepmother Vivian had married my father when I was 17. She was beautiful in the way a winter storm is beautiful, all sharp edges and cold brilliance. I had tried to love her, or at least to understand her, but she had never wanted my affection. She wanted only what my father could give her, and when he died, she wanted what he had left behind: the fortune, the estate, the name that opened doors in London society. But my father, in his final act of love for me, had written his will with careful precision. Everything would pass to me upon my marriage. Until then, Vivian would serve as guardian of the estate, but she could not touch the fortune itself. It sat locked away, waiting for me to claim it with a ring on my finger. I did not know then how dangerous it is to stand between an ambitious woman and the thing she desires most. The first signs came slowly, like poison dropped into wine. Vivian began to speak of my peculiarities to visitors. She mentioned my tendency to read late into the night, as though literacy were a symptom of instability. She whispered about the tears I shed for my father, suggesting that my grief had grown unnatural, excessive. She pointed to my reluctance to attend balls and dinners, spinning my mourning into evidence of social incapacity. And the servants, loyal to whoever paid their wages, began to watch me with different eyes. Then came the physician. Dr. Hartley was a man with soft hands and softer morals, and he arrived at Holloway Manor on a gray November morning with his black bag and his carefully prepared diagnosis. I was summoned to the drawing room, where Vivian sat with her hands folded in her lap, a portrait of maternal concern. The doctor examined me with questions that twisted in the air like snakes. Did I hear voices? Did I see things that were not there? Did I sometimes feel that the world was not real, that I was watching my life from very far away? I answered honestly. I told him that grief had made the world feel strange, that some mornings I woke forgetting my father was gone, only to remember and feel the loss fresh as a wound. I told him that I found comfort in books because they asked nothing of me, and that I preferred the company of my own thoughts to the shallow conversation of society gatherings. I did not know that honesty would be my undoing. Dr. Hartley nodded gravely, making notes in a leather journal. When he finished, he spoke not to me, but to Vivian. He spoke of hysteria, of melancholia, of a delicate female constitution overwhelmed by loss. He recommended rest, seclusion, removal from the stimulations that might worsen my condition. And Vivian, with tears glistening in her eyes that I now know were tears of triumph, agreed that my welfare must come first. That night, 2 footmen I did not recognize escorted me to the east wing of the manor, up a narrow staircase I had rarely climbed, to a set of rooms beneath the roof that had once belonged to a governess long since departed. The door locked behind me with a sound I would hear in my nightmares for years to come. I screamed at first. I pounded on the door until my fists were bruised and my voice was ragged. I demanded to see my stepmother, demanded to know what right she had to imprison me in my own home. But no one answered. The servants had been told I was dangerous, that my fits of madness made me unpredictable. They brought my meals on trays and left them outside the door, retreating before I could speak a word to them. I was a ghost, haunting my own life, invisible and unheard. The rooms themselves were not cruel. There was a bed with clean linens, a chair by the window, a small writing desk, even a shelf of books that someone had thought to provide. The window looked out over the gardens I had loved as a girl, And on clear days I could see the road that led away from Holloway, the road I could no longer walk. Vivian had been clever. She had not thrown me into a dark cell or chained me to a wall. She had simply removed me from the world with the efficiency of someone filing away a document that was no longer needed. The seasons passed like pages turning. I watched winter bleach the gardens white and spring coax them back to green. I read every book on my shelf until I could recite passages from memory. I wrote letters that no one would ever send, pouring my thoughts onto paper because the alternative was to let them fester in silence. And slowly, terribly, I began to understand my stepmother's plan. She could not inherit my father's fortune, but she could control whoever did. If I married a man of her choosing, a man who would be grateful for the arrangement and compliant with her wishes, she could continue to live as she always had, pulling strings from the shadows while I remained locked away, a wife in name only. The fortune would pass to my husband, and my husband would answer to her. All she needed was to find the right man. I heard whispers of her search through the thin walls and the careless conversations of servants. She was looking for a gentleman in desperate circumstances, someone whose need for money outweighed his need for a real wife. She spoke of debts and scandal and family names tarnished beyond repair. She was looking for a man who would sell his future for gold and ask no questions about the woman he was buying. 3 years I waited, and 3 years I planned. I did not know what form my escape would take, but I refused to believe this room would be my grave. I refused to become the madwoman they said I was. Instead, I became patient. I became watchful. I became a woman made of waiting. And then, on an evening when the rain hammered against my window like 1,000 desperate fists, I heard footsteps on the stairs that were heavier than any servant's tread. The door opened, and Vivian stood in the frame. She was older now, lines carved around her mouth that had not been there before, but her eyes held the same cold satisfaction I remembered from that first terrible night. Behind her stood a man I did not recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that might have been handsome if it were not set in such grim determination. I rose from my chair slowly, my heart pounding beneath my ribs. Vivian smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has finally completed a difficult task. She said, "Rosalind, allow me to introduce your husband, Lord Edmund Ashworth. You were married this morning by proxy. The paperwork is quite complete. I heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away. Married by proxy. Without my knowledge, without my consent, they had bound me to a stranger while I sat in my prison reading poetry and watching the rain. The man, Edmund, stood perfectly still. He did not look at me with pity or disgust or curiosity. He looked at me the way one might look at a piece of furniture that came with a house one had purchased, something to be acknowledged and then ignored. His jaw was tight, and I noticed that his hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists. Whatever bargain he had made with my stepmother, he was not at peace with it. Vivian continued speaking, explaining the terms of the arrangement in a voice bright with false cheer. Edmund would receive the fortune that was now legally his as my husband. In exchange, he would allow me to remain in my current accommodations, where I could be properly cared for without burdening him with my presence. The marriage would exist on paper, nothing more. He was free to live his life as though I did not exist, and I would continue to live mine in this room, this prison, this tomb. She spoke of me as though I were not standing 3 feet away. She spoke of my madness, my instability, the danger I posed to myself and others. She painted a portrait of a creature so broken that kindness demanded her confinement. And Edmund listened without expression, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, refusing to meet my gaze. When Vivian finished, she turned to leave, clearly expecting Edmund to follow. But he did not move. He stood in the doorway, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. I do not know what he expected to see. Perhaps he had imagined a wild-eyed wraith, a woman driven to true madness by years of isolation. Perhaps he had prepared himself for tears or screaming or the desperate pleading of someone whose sanity had crumbled under the weight of captivity. But I gave him none of those things. Instead, I met his gaze steadily and spoke the first words I had spoken to anyone but myself in nearly 3 years. I said, "You should know that everything she told you is a lie. I am not mad. I have never been mad. I am simply inconvenient." He froze. I watched the color drain from his face as my words reached him, as their meaning settled into his mind like a stone dropped into still water. His eyes searched my face, looking for the signs of instability he had been promised, and finding instead only a woman who had learned to survive by turning her rage into something cold and patient and enduring. Vivian's voice cut through the silence, sharp with warning. She said my episodes often manifested this way, that I could seem perfectly lucid before the fits overtook me. She urged Edmund to come away, to leave me to the care of those who understood my condition. But Edmund did not move. He stared at me as though he were seeing me for the first time, as though everything he had believed about this arrangement was crumbling around him like a house built on sand. I took a step closer, close enough that I could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the uncertainty that flickered behind his careful mask. I said, "You married me for money. I understand. Desperation makes us capable of things we never imagined. But you should know what you have done. You have not married a madwoman. You have married a prisoner, and every coin you spend will be stained with the price of my freedom." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. I had rendered him silent, this man who had sold himself for gold without ever asking what the gold would cost. Vivian seized his arm and pulled him toward the door, her voice rising with an edge of panic I had never heard from her before. She had not expected me to speak. She had not expected me to be anything more than a shadow, a silent figure in the corner who would confirm her lies simply by existing. But I had refused to play my part, and now the first cracks were forming in the story she had so carefully constructed. The door closed behind them, and the lock turned with its familiar click. I was alone again, as I had been for 3 years. But something had changed. I had seen the doubt in Edmund's eyes, the hesitation that flickered across his face before Vivian dragged him away. He had expected a transaction, simple and clean. He had not expected a woman who could look him in the eye and name his sins. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cold glass. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to part, revealing a sky full of stars I had watched from this same window 1,000 times before. But tonight they looked different. Tonight they looked like the first lights of a distant shore, a promise that the endless ocean of my captivity might finally have a horizon. I did not know what Edmund would do with the truth I had given him. Perhaps he would choose to believe Vivian, to accept her comfortable lies and live his life counting my father's money while I rotted away above his head. Perhaps the desperation that had driven him to this marriage would prove stronger than whatever conscience still flickered within him. But perhaps not. Perhaps I had planted a seed that would grow into something neither of us could predict. I had waited 3 years for a door to open. Now one had, if only for a moment. And I had learned long ago that a moment is all it takes for everything to change. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, and I thought about the man who now bore my name as I bore his. Lord Edmund Ashworth, my husband, my jailer's accomplice, or perhaps my only hope of escape. I would not know which until he returned. And something told me, as surely as I knew my own heartbeat, that he would return. I had given him a splinter of doubt, and doubt, once lodged beneath the skin, has a way of working itself deeper until it cannot be ignored. I was still a prisoner. I was still alone. But for the first time in 3 years, I was not without hope. And hope, I had learned, is the most dangerous thing a captive can possess. He returned 3 days later, and he came alone. I heard his footsteps on the stairs long before the door opened. They were slower than before, hesitant, as though each step required a decision he was not certain he wished to make. I set down the book I had been pretending to read and rose to face the door, my heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs. I had spent 3 days wondering if my words had meant anything at all, if the doubt I had seen in his eyes had been nothing more than surprise at encountering a coherent sentence from the woman he had been told was beyond reason. Now I would have my answer. The lock turned, the door swung open, and there stood Edmund Ashworth, without Vivian at his side, without the armor of her lies to shield him from the truth of what he had done. He looked different in the daylight that filtered through my window. The harsh determination I had seen on his face that first night had softened into something more complicated, something I could not quite name. He wore a dark coat and carried his hat in his hands, turning it slowly between his fingers as though he did not know what to do with them. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, two strangers bound together by a ceremony neither of us had chosen, trying to find the words for a conversation that had no precedent. It was Edmund who broke the silence. He said, "I have spent 3 days trying to convince myself that your stepmother was right, that what I saw was merely a convincing performance, a symptom of whatever affliction keeps you confined here. It would have been easier to believe that." I remained still, waiting. He continued, his voice low and rough. "But I could not make myself believe it. I have seen madness, true madness. My own mother suffered from it in her final years, and I know the look it leaves in a person's eyes. What I saw in yours was not madness. It was fury. It was clarity. It was the kind of patience that comes from having nothing left to lose. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tightness I had not realized I was holding. He believed me. Or at least, he was beginning to. It was more than I had allowed myself to hope for. I said, "Then you understand what this marriage truly is. You have made yourself complicit in my imprisonment. Every day that I remain in this room, you are as much my jailer as she is." He flinched as though I had struck him, and I watched shame color his features. He said, "I did not know." When Mrs. Fairfax approached me with the arrangement, she spoke only of a woman too fragile for the world, a gentle soul who required protection and seclusion for her own safety. She said you were content here, that you preferred the quiet, that marriage was a formality required to release your inheritance. I believed her because I needed to believe her, because the alternative was to examine my own desperation, and that was a mirror I could not face. I studied him as he spoke, searching for the lie beneath the confession, but I found only the raw honesty of a man confronting his own weakness. Whatever else Edmund Ashworth might be, he was not practiced at deception. His guilt was written across his face as clearly as words on a page. I asked him what had brought him to such desperate circumstances, what had driven him to marry a woman he had never met for money he had not earned. It was a cruel question, perhaps, but I had spent 3 years locked away because of other people's secrets. I was done accepting mysteries where explanations were owed. Edmund walked to the window and stood where I had stood so many nights, looking out at the gardens that stretched toward the distant road. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as though he were recounting events that had happened to someone else. He told me of his family estate, Ashworth Hall, which had stood for 6 generations in the north of England. His father had been a proud man, but a poor manager of money, and his grandfather had been worse. By the time Edmund inherited the title at 23, the estate was drowning in debts he had not created and could not escape. He had spent nearly a decade trying to save it, selling paintings and silver and parcels of land, dismissing servants who had worked for his family their entire lives, watching the house he loved crumble piece by piece while creditors circled like wolves. When Vivian found him, he had been weeks away from losing everything. She had offered him a lifeline, and he had seized it without asking what it would cost. He had told himself it was not truly wrong that a woman confined for her own welfare would not be harmed by a marriage that existed only on paper. He had told himself many things in those desperate days, and he had believed them because the alternative was to watch his family name vanish into disgrace. "But now," he said, turning from the window to face me, "now I have seen you. I have heard you speak, and I cannot pretend any longer that this arrangement is anything other than what it is." I asked him what he intended to do with this realization. Guilt was a fine thing to feel, but it changed nothing if it remained only a feeling. I was still locked in this room. Vivian still held the keys, and the fortune that now belonged to him by law was the same fortune that kept my prison running. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not yet know. Your stepmother has made it clear that any attempt to interfere with your care would be seen as a sign that I myself have been deceived by your episodes, that my judgment cannot be trusted. She holds leverage over me that I cannot easily escape. The debts I owed were purchased by her agents before the marriage, and she has made it known that she could call them in at any moment, destroying what little remains of my family's standing. She is careful, she is thorough, and she is watching." I felt a cold satisfaction in hearing my suspicions confirmed. Vivian had not chosen Edmund only for his desperation. She had chosen him because his desperation could be controlled. She had purchased his debts so that she could own him as completely as she owned me, ensuring that even if he discovered the truth, he would be too afraid to act on it. I said, "So you came here to confess your sins and then return to your life unchanged. You wanted absolution without action. You wanted me to forgive you so that you could forgive yourself." His jaw tightened. "That is not why I came." "Then why?" "Because I need to understand," he said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. "I need to know who you truly are, what happened to put you here, what your stepmother is protecting. I cannot make things right if I do not know what has been made wrong." It was a reasonable request, and yet I hesitated. 3 years of solitude had taught me the value of guarding my thoughts. I had spoken to no one in all that time, had trusted no one with the truth of my situation. And now this stranger, this man who had sold himself for gold, was asking me to open the doors I had kept so carefully locked. But what choice did I have? If Edmund was to be my ally, he needed to understand the full scope of Vivian's treachery. And if he was to remain my enemy, then nothing I told him could make my situation worse than it already was. So I told him everything. I told him about my father, a man of quiet kindness and considerable wealth, who had loved me with the steady devotion of someone who had lost my mother too soon, and saw in me the echo of the woman he had adored. I told him about my childhood at Holloway Manor, the gardens where I had played, the library where I had learned to love books, the life of comfort and safety that I had taken for granted until it was stripped away. I told him about Vivian's arrival when I was 17, how she had charmed my father with her beauty and wit, how she had smiled at me across the dinner table while calculating exactly what my existence would cost her. I told him about the marriage that had made her mistress of this house, about the subtle ways she had begun to isolate my father from his friends and his family, about the slow poisoning of his trust in everyone but her. I told him about my father's death, sudden and unexpected, and about the will that had left everything to me, the will that had turned me from a stepdaughter to be tolerated into an obstacle to be removed. And I told him about the night they had locked me away, about the physician with his prepared diagnosis, about the servants who had looked away as I was led up these stairs for what I did not know would be the last time. I told him about the silence and the loneliness and the slow erosion of hope that comes from knowing the world believes you no longer exist. When I finished, Edmund's face was ashen. He gripped the windowsill as though he needed it to keep himself upright. I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew, rebuilding his understanding of this house and the woman who ran it. He said, "She means to keep you here forever. As long as you are alive and married, she controls the fortune through me. If you die, the estate passes to your heir, and she loses her hold. She needs you alive but silent. She needs you to be exactly what she has made you." I nodded. It had taken me months to arrive at the same conclusion, but Edmund had grasped it within hours of learning the truth. Whatever his flaws, he was not a stupid man. He asked why I had not tried to escape, why I had not screamed from the window or bribed a servant or found some way to send word to the outside world. It was the question I had asked myself 1,000 times in those early months when I still believed escape was possible. I explained that Vivian had thought of everything. The servants were chosen for their loyalty to her and their fear of my supposed madness. The window was too high to jump from without breaking my legs, and even if I survived the fall, where would I go? I had no money, no connections, no proof of my sanity against the word of a respectable widow and a licensed physician. The few letters I had attempted to smuggle out had been intercepted and used as evidence of my deteriorating condition. My desperate scribblings presented to the household as the ravings of a mind beyond saving. I had learned to stop trying because every attempt made my prison smaller, my chains tighter. I had learned that survival sometimes means waiting for the right moment rather than throwing yourself against walls that will not break. Edmund was silent for a long time after I finished speaking. The light outside the window had shifted from gold to amber, the afternoon wearing on while we stood in the wreckage of his illusions. Finally, he said, "I cannot undo what I have done. I cannot give back the freedom I helped steal from you. But I can try to find a way forward that does not leave you rotting in this room for the rest of your life." I asked him how. His debts were in Vivian's hands. His reputation would be destroyed if he challenged her. He had no power in this house that she had not given him, and everything he owned now belonged to her in all but name. He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw something other than guilt in his eyes. I saw the beginning of resolve. He said, "Your stepmother believes she has purchased my obedience. She believes I am too weak and too desperate to challenge her. And perhaps she is right, but weakness can be a disguise as easily as madness can. She is not the only one who knows how to wait." I did not know what to make of this declaration. It might have been the empty promise of a man trying to ease his conscience, words that would evaporate like morning mist once he returned to the comfortable life my fortune had bought him. But there was something in his voice, something in the set of his jaw, that made me think he might mean what he said. He turned to leave, and I called out to him. I asked when he would return. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. He said, "I do not know, but I will return. That much I can promise you." The door closed behind him, and the lock turned once more. I was alone again, as I had been alone for 3 years. But the room felt different now, as though his presence had left some invisible mark on the air. I had spoken to another human being, truly spoken, for the first time since my captivity began. I had told my story to someone who might actually listen. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Below, I saw Edmund emerge from the house and walk toward the stables, his stride quick and purposeful. He did not look back at my window, but I had the sense that he knew I was watching. I did not trust him. Trust was a luxury I could not afford, not after everything I had endured. But I was willing to hope, and hope was more than I had allowed myself in a very long time. That night, I dreamed of open doors and roads that stretched toward a horizon I had almost forgotten existed. When I woke, the dream faded, but something remained. A small, fragile thing that I cupped in my hands, like a candle flame in a storm. Edmund had called himself weak, but he had come to me alone, against Vivian's wishes, against his own interests. He had listened to my story and believed me when he could have chosen comfort over truth. Perhaps that was not weakness at all. Perhaps that was the first trembling step of a man learning to be brave. I would wait and see. I had become very good at waiting. And if he failed me, if he proved to be nothing more than another disappointment in a life already full of them, I would find another way. I had not survived 3 years of darkness to surrender now. Whatever happened, whatever Edmund did or did not do, I would find my way back to the world. The only question was whether he would help me or whether I would have to walk that road alone. The weeks that followed were strange and tender, like the first green shoots pushing through snow. Edmund began visiting me regularly, always in the quiet hours of late afternoon when Vivian was occupied with correspondence or callers. He would climb the narrow stairs to my prison with books tucked under his arm, with news from the world beyond my window, with questions that told me he was trying to understand not just my circumstances, but who I had been before they were taken from me. And I, who had grown so accustomed to silence, found myself speaking more in those stolen hours than I had in all my years of captivity combined. He brought me volumes of poetry because I had mentioned once that I missed the rhythm of verse. He brought me pressed flowers from the garden because I had told him how I used to walk those paths in the mornings before my father died. He brought me news of Parliament and society, of scandals and triumphs that meant nothing to me but everything to him, because he wanted me to feel that I still existed in a world that had forgotten my name. At first, I accepted these gifts with suspicion. I had been alone so long that kindness felt like a trap, each gentle gesture a potential weapon waiting to be turned against me. But Edmund asked for nothing in return. He did not press me for gratitude or affection. He simply sat in the chair by my window and talked to me as though I were a person worthy of conversation. And slowly, imperceptibly, the walls I had built around my heart began to show cracks. I learned things about him in those visits that I had not expected to discover. I learned that he had a sister, younger than himself, who had married a clergyman and moved to a parish in the West Country. He spoke of her with a tenderness that surprised me, describing how he had taught her to ride when they were young, how she had wept when he left for school, how she still wrote him letters full of concern for his well-being, even though she knew nothing of his true circumstances. I learned that he loved music, though he claimed to have no talent for it himself, and that he had once dreamed of traveling to Italy to see the great cathedrals and galleries before debt had made such dreams impossible. I learned that he carried guilt not just for what he had done to me, but for 100 smaller failures, moments when he had chosen the easy path over the right one, times when he had looked away from suffering because facing it would have cost him something he was not prepared to pay. He did not offer these confessions as excuses. He offered them as evidence, proof that he understood why I might never trust him, why I might always see him as the man who had sold himself for gold, rather than the man he was trying to become. And I, in turn, found myself sharing pieces of my past that I had thought locked away forever. I told him about my mother, who had died when I was 7, leaving behind only a portrait that hung in the gallery and a faint memory of lavender perfume. I told him about the governess who had raised me in her absence, a stern but loving woman named Miss Pemberton who had taught me Latin and mathematics and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own mind. I told him about the dreams I had once had, dreams of traveling and learning and perhaps one day writing books of my own, dreams that seemed as distant now as the stars I watched from my window. Edmund listened to everything I said with an attention that felt almost sacred. He did not interrupt or offer advice or try to fix what could not be fixed. He simply witnessed my story, and in that witnessing, he gave me something I had not realized I was missing. He gave me the feeling that my life still mattered, that my memories were worth preserving, that I was more than the prisoner Vivian had made me. One afternoon, perhaps 6 weeks after his first solo visit, Edmund arrived with a different energy than usual. There was a tension in his movements, a brightness in his eyes that I had not seen before. He closed the door behind him and crossed the room to where I sat, and when he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. He said, "I have found something. In your stepmother's study, hidden in a drawer she believes no one knows about. Letters between her and Dr. Hartley, dating back to before your father died." My heart began to pound. I asked him what the letters said, He told me that they spoke of arrangements, of payments made for services rendered, of a diagnosis prepared months before I had ever been examined. Vivian had planned my imprisonment long before my father's death, had selected the physician who would condemn me, and scripted the words he would use to do it. She had never believed I was mad. She had simply decided that I would be, and she had purchased the evidence to prove it. I felt the room tilt around me. I had known, of course, that my confinement was a lie. I had known that Vivian was capable of cruelty beyond imagining. But to hear it confirmed, to know that there was proof somewhere in this house that could set me free, was almost more than I could bear. I asked Edmund where the letters were now, whether he had taken them. His face fell. He said that he had not dared remove them, not yet. Vivian was careful, and if she discovered that someone had been searching her private papers, she would know immediately who was responsible. He needed to find a way to copy them or to retrieve them at a moment when suspicion would not fall on him. He needed time. Time. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. I had given 3 years of my life to time, had watched the seasons turn and turn again while I waited for something to change. And now Edmund was asking me to wait longer, to trust that he would find a way before Vivian discovered his treachery and destroyed us both. But what choice did I have? The letters existed. The proof of my sanity was real, hidden somewhere below my feet in a study I could not reach. If Edmund could retrieve them, if he could find a way to bring them before the right eyes, everything might change. I told him I understood. I told him to be careful. And then, without planning to, without understanding why, I reached out and took his hand. It was the first time I had touched another person in 3 years. His fingers were warm against mine, solid and real in a way that made the world suddenly seem less like a dream from which I might wake to find myself still alone. He looked down at our joined hands with an expression I could not read, and when he raised his eyes to mine, there was something in them that made my breath catch. He said my name, just my name, nothing more. Rosalind. But the way he said it carried more meaning than 1,000 words could have conveyed. I pulled my hand away, frightened by the feeling that had risen in my chest. I could not afford to feel this way. I could not afford to let my heart become tangled with a man who might fail me, who might prove to be just another disappointment in a life already full of them. I had survived by keeping myself apart, by refusing to need anyone or anything beyond my own determination. If I began to need Edmund, I would be giving him a power over me that I had sworn never to give again. He seemed to understand because he did not press. He simply nodded once, as though accepting a boundary I had drawn, and returned to his chair by the window. We spent the rest of the afternoon in quieter conversation, speaking of books and weather and nothing of consequence. But the air between us had changed. Something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. That night, after he left, I stood at my window for hours. The moon was full, casting silver light across the gardens below, and I watched the shadows move among the hedges like ghosts of the girl I had once been. I thought about Edmund's hand in mine, about the warmth of his skin and the look in his eyes when he spoke my name. I thought about the letters hidden in Vivian's study, the proof of her crimes waiting to be brought into the light. And I thought about what would happen if we succeeded. If the letters were retrieved and my sanity was proven, if Vivian was exposed and I was finally set free, what then? Would Edmund and I go our separate ways, our marriage dissolved as easily as it had been created? Would he return to his crumbling estate with my fortune in his pocket and forget the woman he had found in the attic? Or would there be something more, something that neither of us had anticipated when this strange alliance began? I did not know. I could not know. The future was a country I had stopped believing I would ever visit, a place that existed only in stories and dreams. But for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine it. I allowed myself to picture a life beyond these walls, a life where I could walk in the garden and feel the sun on my face and speak to whomever I pleased without fear of punishment. And in that imagined future, Edmund was there. I did not know what role he played, whether he was friend or husband or something else entirely, but he was there. His presence had become woven into my hopes without my permission, and I did not know how to untangle it. The weeks continued, and our visits continued with them. Edmund reported on his slow progress, the careful reconnaissance he was conducting of Vivian's habits and movements. He had learned which servants were loyal to her and which might be persuaded to look the other way. He had discovered that she left the house every Thursday afternoon to visit friends in the village, a window of time when her study might be accessed without detection. He was building a plan, piece by piece, and I watched him build it with a mixture of hope and terror. But Vivian was not idle either. I noticed changes in her behavior, small things that might have meant nothing to anyone else, but that sent warning bells ringing through my mind. She began visiting me more often, appearing at my door with false smiles and probing questions. She asked about my health, my spirits, whether I was sleeping well. She watched me with eyes that saw too much, and I knew she was searching for cracks in the facade of madness I had learned to maintain in her presence. I played my part as I always had, letting my gaze wander, letting my words trail off into nothing, presenting myself as the empty vessel she needed me to be. But I could feel her suspicion like a weight pressing against my skin. She knew something had changed, even if she did not yet know what. One evening, she arrived at my door with Dr. Hartley at her side. I had not seen him since that first terrible examination, and the sight of his soft hands and empty eyes made my stomach turn. He examined me again, asking the same questions he had asked years before, watching my responses with professional detachment. I answered as I always did, vaguely and without conviction, letting him draw whatever conclusions he wished. When he finished, he pronounced me unchanged, still fragile, still unfit for the demands of normal life, still requiring the protection of seclusion. Vivian nodded gravely, thanking him for his continued care, and I saw money change hands before they left my room together. But as the door closed behind them, I caught Vivian's eye for just a moment. And in that moment, I saw something that chilled me to my bones. She did not look satisfied. She did not look relieved. She looked suspicious, and beneath the suspicion, she looked afraid. She knew. Perhaps not everything. Perhaps not the specifics of Edmund's investigation or the existence of the letters he had found. But she knew that something had shifted in the balance of power, that the prisoner she had created was no longer as broken as she appeared. And Vivian, I understood with sudden clarity, was at her most dangerous when she was afraid. I had to warn Edmund. I had to tell him that time was running out, that Vivian was circling closer, that whatever plan he was building needed to be executed before she struck first. But I had no way to reach him except through these walls, no way to send a message that would not be intercepted by the very servants who kept me caged. All I could do was wait. Wait and hope that he would come again before it was too late. Wait and trust that the man I had begun to care for was clever enough to see the danger that was closing in around us both. That night, I did not dream of open doors. I dreamed of fire, of flames consuming the house around me while I stood at my window and watched the world burn. And when I woke, gasping in the darkness, I knew that the dream was a warning. We were running out of time, and if we did not move soon, everything we had built would turn to ash. The blow came sooner than I had feared, and from a direction I had not anticipated. It was a Thursday, the day Vivian usually left for her visits in the village, and I had spent the morning pacing my small room like a caged animal, waiting for Edmund to appear with news of his progress. He had promised to attempt the study today, to finally retrieve the letters that could prove my sanity and expose my stepmother's crimes. Every sound on the stairs made my heart leap. Every creak of the old house sent me rushing to the door to listen. But the footsteps I finally heard were not Edmund's measured tread. They were quicker, lighter, accompanied by the rustle of silk and the sharp tap of heeled shoes. The door flew open, and Vivian stood in the frame, her face pale with fury and something else, something that looked almost like triumph. She said, "Did you think I would not discover it? Did you think you could steal from me in my own house and I would remain ignorant?" My blood turned to ice. I asked her what she meant, though I already knew. Somehow, impossibly, she had found out about the letters. She had found out about Edmund. Vivian stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. Her movements were controlled, precise, the careful grace of a predator who knows her prey cannot escape. She said that she had suspected something for weeks, ever since Edmund had begun making his little visits to the attic. She had thought at first that he was simply curious, that he wanted to see the madwoman he had married and satisfy whatever morbid fascination had taken hold of him. But then she had noticed other things, the way he lingered in the halls near her study, the questions he asked the servants about her schedule, the look in his eyes when he returned from his visits with me, a look that spoke of purpose rather than pity. So she had set a trap. She had left her study unlocked, had placed a single hair across the drawer where she kept her most private correspondence, and she had waited. And this morning, when she checked the drawer before leaving for the village, the hair was gone and the letters had been disturbed. Edmund had been careless, and his carelessness had doomed us both. I asked her where Edmund was now. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. Vivian smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I had ever seen on a human face. She said that Edmund was in the library, under guard by two of the footmen she trusted most. She said that she had confronted him with his betrayal, had watched him try to deny it before the evidence became overwhelming. She said that he had confessed everything in the end, including the nature of our conversations, including the feelings he had developed for the mad wife he had been told to ignore. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said, "He told me he loves you." Can you imagine? The fool actually believes himself in love with a lunatic locked in an attic. I almost felt sorry for him. The words struck me like physical blows. Edmund had confessed. Edmund had told her about us, about everything we had shared and everything we had hoped to accomplish. I did not know whether to feel betrayed or terrified or heartbroken, and so I felt all three at once. A storm of emotion that threatened to tear me apart from the inside. But I could not afford to fall apart. Not now, not when everything depended on whatever strength I could summon. I forced myself to meet Vivian's eyes, to keep my voice steady as I asked her what she intended to do. She straightened, smoothing her skirts with an air of satisfaction. She said that Edmund would be dealt with appropriately. The debts she held over him would be called in immediately, and when he could not pay, she would see him ruined. His estate would be seized, his name dragged through every gossip sheet in London, his sister's respectable marriage tarnished by association with a bankrupt and a fool. By the time she was finished, no one would believe a word he said about letters or conspiracies or wives imprisoned without cause. He would be just another desperate man making wild accusations against a respectable widow, and society would dismiss him as easily as it had dismissed me. And as for me, she continued, her smile widening, I had proven myself more troublesome than she had anticipated. Clearly, the current arrangements were insufficient to contain my dangerous delusions. Dr. Hartley had recommended a more secure facility, a private asylum where patients with my particular affliction could receive the intensive care they required. She had already made inquiries, and there was a room waiting for me by the end of the week, an asylum. The word echoed in my mind like a death sentence. I had heard stories of such places, institutions where the inconvenient and the unwanted were locked away forever, where treatments designed to cure often destroyed instead. If Vivian sent me there, I would never escape. I would spend the rest of my days drugged and restrained, and eventually I would become the madwoman she had always claimed I was, my sanity eroded by the very system meant to restore it. I could not let that happen. I would not let that happen. Something shifted inside me, some final barrier breaking under the weight of desperation. I had spent 3 years being patient, being careful, being the quiet prisoner who waited for rescue. But rescue had failed. Edmund had been caught, the letters had been discovered, and every hope I had nurtured was crumbling to dust around me. If I was going to survive, I would have to save myself. I looked at Vivian, at the woman who had stolen everything from me, and I let her see for the first time what lay beneath my careful mask. I let her see the rage I had hidden for 3 years, the hatred that had kept me alive when despair would have been easier. I let her see that she had not broken me, that all her scheming and cruelty had only forged me into something harder and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She took a step back, and I saw fear flicker across her face. For just a moment, she was not the powerful manipulator who controlled my fate. She was a woman who had underestimated her enemy, and she was beginning to realize her mistake. I spoke slowly, carefully, letting each word land like a stone. I said, "You have spent 3 years trying to convince the world that I am mad. But you know the truth, Vivian. You have always known. And somewhere in this house, somewhere you thought no one would ever find it, there is proof of what you have done." Edmund found the letters. But letters can be copied. Letters can be memorized. And even if you destroy every piece of paper, you cannot destroy what Edmund knows. You cannot destroy what I know. The truth exists now, outside of your control, and sooner or later it will find its way into the light. Vivian's face hardened. She said that I was bluffing, that Edmund had found nothing of consequence, that my desperate fantasies proved only how far my condition had deteriorated. But I saw the doubt in her eyes. I saw the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her. She was not certain. She could not be certain that Edmund had not already shared what he had discovered, that there were not copies of those letters already on their way to a solicitor or a magistrate or someone else who might take an interest in the fate of a wealthy young woman imprisoned by her stepmother. I pressed my advantage. I told her that Edmund had friends, people who would ask questions if he disappeared or was suddenly ruined. I told her that I had written letters of my own during my captivity, hidden in places she had never thought to search, letters that detailed everything she had done, and that would be found eventually, whether I was alive to guide the searchers or not. I told her that the web she had woven was beginning to unravel, and that every action she took now only pulled the threads faster. Some of this was true. Some of it was fabrication, desperate lies invented in the moment to plant seeds of uncertainty in her mind. But Vivian could not know which was which, and that uncertainty was the only weapon I had left. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched her calculating, weighing her options, trying to determine how much of what I said was real and how much was the ravings of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Finally, she said, "You are cleverer than I gave you credit for, but cleverness will not save you. You have no allies, no resources, no way to act on any of these supposed safeguards you claim to have created. You are still a prisoner, and I still hold the keys." She turned to leave, and as she reached the door, she paused. She said, "Edmund will be gone by morning. I have arranged for his removal from the estate, and you will not see him again. Whatever feelings you imagined existed between you, I suggest you forget them. He was never anything more than a pawn, and pawns are meant to be sacrificed." The door closed. The lock turned, and I was alone with the wreckage of everything I had hoped for. I did not cry. I had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, that grief was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I moved to the window and pressed my palms against the glass, staring out at the gardens below as the afternoon light faded toward evening. Edmund was somewhere in this house, guarded and condemned. By morning, he would be gone, and I would be shipped to an asylum where my voice would finally be silenced forever. Vivian had won. After 3 years of captivity and weeks of fragile hope, she had won. But as I stood there, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn, I noticed something that made my heart stop. A figure was moving through the garden, keeping close to the hedges, moving with the careful purpose of someone who did not wish to be seen. The figure paused beneath my window and looked up, and even in the fading light, I recognized the face. It was Edmund. I did not understand how he had escaped his guards or why he was risking everything to come here now. But he raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant wait, and then he disappeared around the corner of the house, heading toward the servants' entrance. I stood frozen, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this was anything more than a desperate last gesture before our final defeat. But minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs, lighter than before, quicker. The lock rattled, and for a terrible moment I thought it was Vivian returning to finish what she had started. But the door opened, and Edmund stood there, breathless and wild-eyed, with a ring of keys in his hand. He said, "We have to go, now. I have a carriage waiting at the edge of the property, and we have perhaps 20 minutes before they discover I am gone." I stared at him, unable to process what was happening. I asked how he had escaped, how he had gotten the keys, how any of this was possible. He shook his head impatiently. He said there was no time to explain, that every second we delayed brought Vivian's servants closer to discovering his absence. He held out his hand to me, the same hand I had taken weeks ago when I first allowed myself to feel something other than despair. He said, "Do you trust me?" It was a question I had been asking myself for weeks, a question I had never been able to answer. Did I trust this man who had married me for money, who had stumbled into my prison by accident and stayed by choice? Did I trust him enough to follow him into the unknown, to abandon the only home I had ever known for a future I could not predict? I looked at his face, at the desperation and determination written there in equal measure. I looked at his outstretched hand, at the promise it represented. And I thought about what waited for me if I stayed. An asylum. Silence. A slow death of the mind in a place where no one would ever hear me scream. I took his hand. We ran. Down the narrow stairs, through corridors I had not walked in 3 years, past startled servants who called out in confusion as we passed. Edmund knew the house better than I would have expected, leading me through back passages and servants' hallways, avoiding the main rooms where Vivian's guards might be waiting. We burst through a door into the cold night air, and I gasped at the sensation. Wind on my face, stars overhead, the vast open space of the garden stretching before me. I had forgotten what it felt like to be outside, to breathe air that was not confined by walls and windows. For a moment, I could only stand there, overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the world I had been denied. But Edmund pulled me forward, and we ran again, through the garden and past the hedges and down a path that led to a small gate in the estate wall. Beyond it, barely visible in the darkness, a carriage waited with a single lamp burning. We climbed inside, and Edmund called to the driver. The horses lurched forward, and Holloway Manor began to recede behind us, growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a shadow against the darker shadow of the night sky. I sat in the swaying darkness of the carriage, my hand still clasped in Edmund's, and I realized that I was shaking, not with fear, though fear was certainly present. I was shaking with something else, something I had almost forgotten how to feel: freedom. After 3 years, I was free. Edmund was speaking, explaining how he had bribed one of the younger footmen, how he had slipped away during a changing of guards, how he had grabbed the keys from the housekeeper's station and prayed that no one would notice until it was too late. He was explaining where we were going, a cottage belonging to a friend who could be trusted, a place where we could hide while we determined our next steps. But I barely heard him. I was watching the road unfold before us, watching the trees and fields pass by in the moonlight, watching the world I had been denied for so long reveal itself like a gift I had stopped believing I deserved. I turned to Edmund, and in the dim light of the carriage lamp, I saw that he was watching me. His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, but beneath it all there was something else: relief, hope, and something deeper. something that made my breath catch in my throat. I said, "You came back for me. You could have run, could have saved yourself, but you came back." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had ever seen on his face. He said, "I made you a promise. I told you I would find a way. Did you think I would break it?" I did not answer. Instead, I leaned forward and pressed my lips to his, a kiss that tasted of tears and moonlight and the first trembling hope of a new beginning. When I pulled away, his eyes were wide with surprise, but his hand tightened around mine, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The carriage rolled on through the night, carrying us away from the prison that had held me for 3 years and toward a future I could not yet imagine. Behind us, Vivian would be discovering our escape, would be sending riders in pursuit, would be plotting her next move in the game she refused to lose. But for now, in this moment, we were free, and that was enough. Freedom, I discovered, is not a single moment, but a slow awakening, like feeling returning to a limb that has been numb for too long. The cottage where Edmund brought me belonged to a former schoolmate of his, a quiet man named Mr. Whitfield, who asked no questions and offered us shelter without conditions. It was a modest place, tucked into the hills of the countryside, far from Holloway Manor and the reach of Vivian's immediate influence. For the first few days, I could do nothing but sleep and eat and stand at the window watching the sky change colors, marveling at the simple miracle of a horizon unbroken by walls. Edmund gave me space during those early days, seeming to understand that I needed time to remember who I was outside of captivity. He slept in a small room at the back of the cottage while I took the bedroom at the front, and though we shared meals and quiet conversations, he did not press for more than I was ready to give. The kiss in the carriage hung between us like a question neither of us knew how to answer. A promise made in a moment of overwhelming emotion that now required examination in the clearer light of day. But even as I recovered my strength and my bearings, I knew that our respite could not last. Vivian would be searching for us. She would have sent word to every inn and coaching station, would have enlisted Dr. Hartley to speak of a dangerous patient escaped from care, would have painted me as a threat to myself and others who must be returned to custody for my own protection. Every day we remained hidden was borrowed time, and borrowed time eventually comes due. It was Edmund who proposed the solution. He had not told me everything during our escape, had not explained how he intended to fight back against a woman who seemed to hold all the power. But on the 5th night, as we sat before the fire in Mr. Whitfield's modest parlor, he finally revealed his plan. He said, "Before I was caught, I did more than simply find the letters. I copied them. Every word, every damning admission, transcribed in my own hand and sent to a solicitor in London whom I trust with my life. He has instructions to act if he does not hear from me within a fortnight, to bring the evidence before a magistrate and petition for an investigation into your confinement." I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. I asked why he had not told me this before, why he had let me believe that everything was lost when Vivian discovered his search. He looked into the fire, and I saw shame flicker across his features. He said that he had wanted to tell me, but there had been no time during our escape, and afterward he had been afraid. Afraid that the plan would fail, that the solicitor would prove unreliable, that raising my hopes only to dash them again would be crueler than letting me believe the worst. He said he had learned too late that protecting someone by keeping them in darkness is not protection at all, only another form of imprisonment. I understood then that Edmund was still learning, still growing into the man he wanted to become. He had made mistakes, would likely make more, but his heart was oriented toward truth, even when his actions fell short. I could not fault him for failures I had committed myself, for the walls I had built around my own heart out of fear and self-preservation. I told him that I forgave him, and I meant it. The fortnight passed slowly, each day bringing both hope and dread. Edmund sent word to his solicitor confirming that we were safe and urging him to proceed with the petition. We received a reply within the week, a letter that made my hands tremble as I read it. The magistrate had agreed to examine the evidence. The letters between Vivian and Dr. Hartley were damning enough to warrant an official inquiry. And most importantly, a summons had been issued requiring Vivian to appear and answer questions about the circumstances of my confinement. But there was more. The solicitor had done his own investigation, following threads that Edmund's discovery had begun to unravel. He had found servants who had left Holloway Manor over the years, people who had witnessed things they had been afraid to speak of while still under Vivian's employ. He had found records of payments made to Dr. Hartley that extended far beyond any reasonable medical fees. And he had found something else, something that changed everything. My father's death, the solicitor wrote, had not been investigated at the time. It had been attributed to a sudden illness, a failure of the heart, the kind of tragedy that befalls men of a certain age without warning. But several former servants recalled that my father had been in excellent health in the weeks before his death. They recalled that Vivian had insisted on preparing his evening tea herself during that period, a task she had never performed before or since. And they recalled that Dr. Hartley had been present in the house on the night my father died, had been the one to sign the certificate of death, had been paid handsomely for his discretion. I read those words 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated. My father. My kind, loving father, who had tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. Vivian had not merely stolen my freedom. She had stolen his life. The grief that rose in me was different from anything I had felt during my years of captivity. In my prison, I had mourned my father as a loss, an absence, a door that had closed forever. But now I mourned him as a victim, as someone whose trust had been betrayed in the most terrible way imaginable. He had brought Vivian into our home, had loved her as a wife, and she had repaid that love with poison. Edmund held me while I wept, his arms steady around me, his voice murmuring words I could not hear but felt nonetheless. He did not try to fix what could not be fixed. He simply witnessed my grief, as he had witnessed my story all those weeks ago in the attic room, and in that witnessing, he gave me permission to feel everything I had kept locked away. When the tears finally subsided, I knew what I had to do. I had to return to face Vivian, to look her in the eye and speak the truth that had been silenced for so long. I had to reclaim not just my freedom, but my father's memory, his legacy, his name, that she had dragged through the mud with her schemes. Edmund tried to dissuade me. He said it was too dangerous, that Vivian was unpredictable, that we should let the law handle everything and remain safely hidden until the matter was resolved. But I had spent 3 years letting others determine my fate, 3 years being the passive victim of forces beyond my control. I would not hide any longer. Whatever happened, I would face it standing up. We traveled to London together, where the inquiry was to be held. The city was overwhelming after so long in isolation, a chaos of noise and movement that made my head spin and my heart race. But Edmund stayed close, guiding me through the crowded streets, and gradually I began to remember that I had once known how to navigate this world, had once been a young woman with a place in society and a future full of possibilities. The inquiry took place in a wood-paneled room that smelled of dust and old books. Vivian was there, dressed in mourning black as though she were the victim rather than the perpetrator, her face a mask of wounded dignity. Dr. Hartley sat beside her, his soft hands folded in his lap, his expression that of a man who has realized too late that the tide has turned against him. And I was there, seated across from them, with Edmund at my side, and the solicitor presenting the evidence that would determine all our fates. The letters were read aloud, every calculating word exposed to the light. The servants testified, their voices trembling but clear, describing what they had seen and what they had suspected. The physician who had examined me upon my arrival in London testified that I showed no signs of mental illness, that I was a woman of sound mind who had been wrongfully confined. And finally, I testified myself, telling my story from beginning to end, speaking the truth that had been locked away as surely as I had been. Vivian tried to defend herself. She spoke of my instability, my delusions, the danger I posed. She produced documents signed by Dr. Hartley attesting to my condition. She wept artfully, claiming that everything she had done was out of love for me, concern for my welfare, the desperate actions of a stepmother who had no other way to protect her troubled charge. But the magistrate was unmoved. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too damning. When the inquiry concluded, Vivian was arrested on charges of false imprisonment and fraud, with the investigation into my father's death to follow. Dr. Hartley was taken into custody as well, his medical license suspended pending further review, and I, Rosalind Fairfax Ashworth, was declared a free woman of sound mind and full legal capacity, with all rights and properties restored. I stood in the corridor outside the inquiry room, struggling to comprehend that it was over. 3 years of captivity, months of planning and hoping and fearing, and now it was over. Vivian was gone, led away in restraints, her power broken at last. I would never have to see the inside of that attic room again. Edmund stood beside me, and when I turned to look at him, I found that he was already looking at me. There was something in his expression that I had seen glimpses of before, something that had grown stronger through all our trials and now shone openly in his eyes. He said, "You were magnificent in there. You faced her without flinching. You spoke the truth when speaking it was the hardest thing you could have done." I said, "I had help. I could not have done any of this alone." He smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines that worry and guilt had carved there. He said, "You would have found a way. You are the strongest person I have ever known, but I am grateful that you allowed me to stand beside you." I took his hand, there in that corridor where anyone might see, and I did not care. I said, "What happens now?" Our marriage was a fraud, built on lies and desperation. The courts would surely annul it if we asked. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They would, if that is what you want. I have no right to hold you to a contract you never agreed to. The fortune is yours by law, and I will make no claim on it. You owe me nothing." I searched his face, looking for any sign that these words were spoken out of obligation rather than truth. But I found only sincerity, only the genuine offer of a man who had learned that love cannot be taken, only given. I said, "And if what I want is not annulment?" His breath caught. I watched hope war with caution in his eyes, watched him struggle against the belief that he did not deserve what I was offering. He said, "Then I would spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you. I would be your husband in truth, not just in name. I would give you everything I have, though I know it is not much. And I would thank God every morning that you chose to keep me." I stepped closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold corridor. I said, "I did not choose you, Edmund, not at first. You were chosen for me by a woman who thought she could control us both. But somewhere along the way, in that attic room and in the carriage and in all the days since, I began to choose you for myself. I choose you now, not because I must, but because I want to. Because you came back for me when you could have run. Because you saw me when I had forgotten how to be seen. Because you are a good man who is learning to be better, and I want to learn alongside you." He kissed me then, there in the corridor of the magistrate's court, with clerks and solicitors walking past, and the whole world watching. It was not the desperate kiss of our escape, born of fear and relief. It was a promise, a declaration, the first kiss of a marriage that was finally real. We returned to Holloway Manor one last time, not to stay, but to collect what remained of my past. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, as though my freedom had shrunk it to its true proportions. I walked through the rooms where I had grown up, touching the furniture and the walls and the books that had shaped me. I visited my father's portrait in the gallery, and I told him silently that justice had been served, that his memory would be honored, that the woman who had stolen him from me would pay for what she had done. And then I walked up the narrow stairs to the attic, to the room that had been my prison for 3 years. Edmund offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. I needed to stand in that space one final time and know that it could never hold me again. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed still made, the books still lined on their shelf, the chair still positioned by the window where I had spent so many hours watching the world I could not touch. I stood in the center of it all, and I let myself remember the despair of those first weeks, the slow deadening of hope, the books that had kept me sane, the letters I had written to no one, and finally, the day the door had opened and a stranger with dark eyes had looked at me and seen not a madwoman, but a prisoner. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, filling my lungs with air that tasted of dust and memory. And then I turned and walked away, down the stairs and out of the house and into the sunlight where Edmund waited for me. We sold Holloway Manor. I could not bear to live in a place so stained with suffering, and Edmund agreed that a fresh start required fresh surroundings. We used part of my inheritance to restore Ashworth Hall, his family estate that had been crumbling when we met. We filled it with light and laughter and the beginnings of a new life built on foundations of truth rather than deception. Edmund's sister came to visit that first summer, a warm and curious woman named Clara who embraced me as family without hesitation. She told me stories of Edmund as a young man, before debt and desperation had hardened him, and I began to see the boy he had been beneath the man he had become. I told her stories, too, carefully edited, of my years of isolation and how her brother had helped me escape them. She cried and called him a hero, and he blushed and said he was nothing of the sort, and I loved him more in that moment than I had thought possible. Vivian's trial took place the following autumn. She was convicted of false imprisonment and fraud and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The investigation into my father's death proved more difficult, the evidence too old and too circumstantial to support a murder charge. But I had made my peace with that. Justice is not always complete, but incomplete justice is better than none at all. Vivian would spend the rest of her prime years behind bars, as I had spent mine. There was a symmetry in that which satisfied something deep within me. Dr. Hartley lost his license and his reputation. I heard that he had moved to the continent, to some country where his past would not follow him. I hoped that wherever he went, the ghosts of the people he had wronged would find him in his dreams. And I, Rosalind Fairfax Ashworth, finally began to live the life that had been stolen from me. I wrote the books I had dreamed of writing, stories of women who survived impossible circumstances and found their way back to themselves. I walked in the gardens of Ashworth Hall every morning, feeling the sun on my face and the wind in my hair, never again taking for granted the simple miracle of open air. I made friends, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, learning to trust again, one conversation at a time. And I loved Edmund, wholly and without reservation, with the kind of love that grows stronger for having been tested. He was not perfect, and neither was I. We argued sometimes, disagreed about small things and large ones, struggled with the scars that our pasts had left on us both. But we always came back to each other, always found our way through the darkness to the light on the other side. On our first true wedding anniversary, a year after the inquiry that had set me free, Edmund took me to the garden at twilight. The roses were blooming, filling the air with fragrance, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He held my hand as we walked, and I felt the weight of his ring on my finger, the ring I had chosen to keep wearing even when I could have taken it off. He said, "A year ago, you gave me a second chance. You could have walked away, could have built a new life without the man who had helped imprison you. But you chose to stay. You chose me. I will never stop being grateful for that." I smiled and leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my shoulder. I said, "You came back for me when everyone else had abandoned me. You believed me when it would have been easier to believe the lies. You risked everything to set me free. How could I not choose you?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, his hands cupping my face with a tenderness that still made my breath catch after all these months. He said, "I love you, Rosalind. Not the idea of you, not the fortune that came with you, not the redemption you offered me. I love you, exactly as you are, and I will love you for the rest of my days." I kissed him under the stars, in the garden of the home we had built together, and I felt the last chains of my captivity fall away. I was not the madwoman in the attic. I was not the prisoner of Vivian's schemes. I was Rosalind, a survivor and a writer and a wife, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. The past would always be part of me. The years in that attic room had shaped me in ways I was still discovering, had left marks that would never fully fade. But the past did not own me. The future stretched before me like an open road, full of possibilities I had once stopped believing in, and I would walk it with my hand in Edmund's and my heart finally free. They had called me mad, and for 3 years the world had believed them. But I had known the truth all along, had held on to it through darkness and despair and the long silence of captivity. I was not mad. I had never been mad. I was simply a woman who refused to be silenced, and in the end, my voice was the thing that set me free.